Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 15th of June 1924, Mussolini in more or less his own words, the problem with girls' education, and an author of fantasy novels writes about the very real problems of the landed gentry. But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. The President of France, Alexandre Mitterrand, has resigned. This is after the socialist coalition that won the recent elections made it clear that they regarded his staying in post as unacceptable. He is to be replaced by a Monsieur Dumergue. The strike at the Lotts Road power station that paralysed large parts of the London Underground network has ended. There is fighting ongoing in Albania between rebels and government forces. A couple of weeks ago I mentioned the death of Sir Edward Goschen, British ambassador to Germany at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. It was he who claimed that the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, had referred to the treaty that guaranteed Belgian neutrality as a scrap of paper. Since then there has been an ongoing correspondence on the subject of in which language this conversation took place. Britain and Italy are negotiating over the handover of Jubaland. If you didn't know where Jubaland is, or was, and I think you could be forgiven for not knowing that, it is on the border between Kenya and Somalia. But why is Britain handing it over? It's all to do with the end of the First World War. Germany lost all its colonies, and they were divided up between Great Britain and France. Italy said, "What about us?" And Britain and France agreed to make some adjustments on borders like this. Having said that, you do wonder why it has taken 6 years for them to get around to it. The Republican Convention in the United States has selected sitting President Calvin Coolidge as its presidential candidate and General Dawes of Dawes Report fame, see the 13th of April episode, for vice president. Also in the US, an explosion in the turret of the battleship Mississippi has killed 48 sailors. The governor of Jamaica, one Leslie Probyn, has resigned. There has been an ongoing controversy over payments to the head of the railways. One suspects that there's more to this case, but it is yet to appear in the pages of the Times, and there is no mention of this on his Wikipedia page. A Captain Toop, a racing driver, died after his car climbed over the banking at the Brooklands racetrack. Presumably this was an accident. The inquest jury certainly seemed to think so, but you never know. In the 25th of May episode, I referred to the tragic case of Major Bailey. It would appear that he is not the only one for whom the war did not end in 1918. George Bones, a jobbing gardener who served 21 years in the Essex Regiment, jumped from the tower of Wormingford Church near Colchester on Wednesday and was fatally injured. He had suffered from shell shock. There's been an ongoing correspondence over the future of the gorilla. Many, then as now, fear that it faces extinction. I can't deny I was surprised to read that. I thought that concern about endangered species was a much more modern phenomenon, something that came in with the hippies. But it would appear it has been around for much longer. A Toronto doctor has claimed that he has found a cure for cancer. Well, that was Tuesday. Wednesday gave us a lot of scepticism. Rather put me in mind of the death ray story from a fortnight ago. This is not the first time in recent years a Toronto doctor has claimed to have found a miracle cure. Last year, I didn't report it at the time, one of them claimed that he had found a cure for diabetes. Dr. Frederick Banting was, of course, entirely correct. There have been storms in the British Isles, followed by flooding in many places. The communist revolution in Russia may have been characterized by war, violence, imprisonment, execution without trial, persecution of political opponents, starvation and impoverishment of the very people it was supposed to help, but that hasn't stopped its leaders getting on with the important stuff. The Russian coal mining centre of Yuzovka in the Ukraine and the district and the railway station of that name have been renamed by the Soviet authorities Stalin, Stalinsky and Stalino respectively, after Stalin, the member of the triumvirate. Yuzovka is nowadays known as Donetsk, and always will be, because the days when Russia was ruled by psychopathic dictators is very much in the past. More socialism on Saturday. Stanley Baldwin, who has one term as Prime Minister behind him, and, spoiler alert, two ahead of him, gets very little mention in the history books. If anything, it's that he was Prime Minister at the time of the abdication crisis, or that he should have done more to stand up to Hitler. Very few quotes are attributed to him, if any. So it was a pleasant surprise to see him making an important point. The standard of life could only be improved by the most perfect cooperation of those who worked with their hands, of those who directed that labour, and those who supplied the capital. It was only by adding to the pile that was produced by the joint labour of those sections that there could be more to hand out to the population at large, and that they could hope to improve the standard of life. They might quarrel about that distribution, but let them never lose sight of the fundamental fact that the greater the production, the greater the amount to be divided, and the less the amount produced, the less to be divided. This was a point that Margaret Thatcher would make endlessly during her time as Prime Minister. If you want to distribute wealth, first of all, you need some wealth to distribute. What is interesting here is that in the world of 1924, socialists believed they could create a bigger pile, or pie as we tend to say today. Nowadays they are not so sure. On Saturday, the Times published a letter from H. Rider Haggard, author of, amongst many others, King Solomon's Mines. Of the country houses of England, you ask today what is to become of them. If a judgment may be formed from what happens in East Anglia, they must be left desolate, even, great and fair, without inhabitant. Already I know of sundry in such case, that in my youth sheltered families of the stamp that go out to serve the country. Sundry here means several. As for of the stamp, I guess that means families with land. There they stand, empty, and so probably will stand till their roofs fall in. In truth, the facts are even worse than your article suggests. For when all is paid, including the endless cost of repairs and the awful income taxes, not to mention rates, tithe, that's a tax that goes to the church, and the rest, nothing at all remains over from the rent of average land. The decline of the aristocracy is one of the great changes that has occurred over the last century. Certainly industrialization didn't help, creating rival rich people. But taxation, as Haggard mentions, is doing its work, including one tax that Haggard doesn't mention, death duty. Notice that you can't blame the Labour Party for any of this. Friday brought an article written by Miss F. R. Gray, High Mistress of St. Paul's Girls' School and President of the Association of Headmistresses, which was celebrating its 50th birthday. St. Paul's Girls' School, in case you didn't know, is a very superior school in London. She discussed the foundation of the association 50 years before. The headmistresses aimed high from the beginning. In their first minutes they register the hope that before long, through the influence of public opinion, all the university examinations for degrees at present open to men may be available for women. In the 22nd of July 1923 episode, I mentioned an article that seemed to suggest that women could study at Cambridge but not take degrees. Miss Buss, the founder of the association, held very strongly that women should pass the same university examinations as men. It was therefore necessary that girls should work at the same school subjects as boys. And her opinion carried great weight with her fellow members. At first there was a real danger that girls would be seriously overworked. Their teachers were often inexperienced young women who spared neither themselves nor their pupils. Girls are not naturally protected, as boys are, by a healthy dislike to work. She then says this: to the stimulating and therefore at times exhausting work of school, long hours of stupefying and therefore exhausting piano practice at home were added. The late Brian Micklethwaite claimed that women were the hi-fis of the 19th century. How else, after all, could you make music at home? The men were out working. This confirms that. Gray also quotes a Mrs. S. C. Hall. There are not a greater set of muffs and extravagant fellows in life than our college lads. Muff being a bungler. Things have declined. I have had occasion to mention Benito Mussolini a few times on this podcast, but I don't think I have ever quoted him directly. The debate on the address was brought to a close yesterday by a speech by Signor Mussolini in which the Prime Minister replied to his critics. This looks like a good chance. There was nothing new in the opposition, said Signor Mussolini. For 20 months the opposition had kept on repeating the same arguments. The only new ones brought forward now were about the Italian elections and the elections in other countries. But the result of the elections in Germany and France did not show conclusively that in those countries the pendulum had swung to the left. And then, talking about Britain, he said this. Besides, Labour was not to be compared with continental socialism. Labour is a serious thing. Coming to the Italian elections, Signor Mussolini admitted that the opposition could not hold meetings, but he contended that electoral meetings are not profitable. Electoral meetings are attended by all sorts of people but electors. You thought it looked like he was persecuting his opponents, but in reality he was saving them wasted effort. How generous. He denied that acts of violence were committed during the elections, but he remarked that, after all, if a revolution may be legalized by the votes of the electorate, it may also do without it. He denied that a regime could rest exclusively on consent. Side by side with the consent, there was always force. Whatever this may be, it is certainly not a wholehearted endorsement of democracy. It was said that there was no liberty in Italy. But the idea of liberty has not been defined yet, and perhaps never will be. That's a lie. By that time there were plenty of definitions of liberty, and they were more or less all the same. The opposition existed, and must exist. Your mileage may vary. What irritated him was not the opposition, but its ways. The Italian opposition, in the opinion of Signor Mussolini, had many vices. First, it would not forgive fascism for its revolutionary origin. Secondly, it gave itself great airs, as if knowledge and intelligence were the monopoly of the opposition. Thirdly, it busied itself too much with the internal affairs and feuds of fascism. A dictator admitting to internal disputes? Something of a rarity. He said what, in his opinion, the opposition might do. It might confine itself to examining the reforms which were proposed and criticize and oppose them if they were bad. And if they don't? Well, tomorrow, the 10th of June 1924, an opposition leader will, spoiler alert, be murdered. Although this won't be reported in the Times until, spoiler alert again, next week. He also had this to say. He had no faith in the League of Nations. But Italy must remain in it, because if Italy came out of it, the others would be glad and would do their business and look after their interest within the League of Nations without Italy and occasionally against Italy. Who does this remind me of? Rigged elections, opposition politicians killed, contempt for international norms? Oh, it's gone. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.